An elderly woman is evicted from her home for not paying 1 month's rent to a wealthy young woman. A month later, when the young woman sees the elderly woman begging, she's devastated to recognize a sapphire ring that belonged to her mother. Dorothy Miller, a 72-year-old lady, was sitting in her worn armchair in her small Boston apartment. Her hands began to tremble as she held the eviction notice. Her eyes, framed by deep wrinkles that told stories of laughter and tears, scanned the harsh words on the paper. Dorothy took a deep breath, the air heavy with the lavender scent from the sachet she always kept close, a reminder of happier times. She slowly got up, her arthritis protesting with every movement, and walked to the window. Outside, golden leaves danced in the wind, oblivious to the drama unfolding within those thin walls. With a heavy sigh, Dorothy grabbed her tattered coat and went out to face Karen Pearson, the young property owner. The old building's hallway creaked under her feet, echoing the passage of time and the stories of so many others who had lived there. Karen was waiting in the lobby, her slender and elegant figure contrasting sharply with the worn surroundings. Her cold eyes scanned Dorothy from top to bottom, barely hiding her disdain. "Dorothy, you're behind on the rent again," Karen said, her voice sharp like the cold wind outside. Dorothy felt the weight of those words in her heart. "I know, Miss Pearson. I had some setbacks this month. My medications got more expensive and—" Karen interrupted with a dismissive gesture. "I'm not interested in your excuses. You have 1 week to move out." The words hit Dorothy like a punch to the stomach. She staggered slightly, leaning against the peeling wall. "Please, Miss Pearson," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "This place has been my home for decades. I just need a little more time." For a brief moment, something resembling compassion flickered in Karen's eyes, but it was quickly replaced by the cold mask of indifference. "Rules are rules, Mrs. Miller. A week." With that, Karen turned on her heel and walked away, the sound of her high heels echoing in the empty lobby, each click like a nail in the coffin of Dorothy's hopes. Dorothy stood there, feeling the weight of the world on her hunched shoulders. Silent tears streamed down her wrinkled cheeks as she looked around, taking in every detail of the place she called home. The peeling walls, the worn banister, even the musty smell. Everything was a part of her. Slowly, Dorothy climbed the stairs back to her apartment. Each step felt like a mountain, each breath a Herculean effort. When she entered, her eyes fell on the old mahogany dresser in the corner, the only piece of furniture left from better times. With trembling hands, she opened the top drawer and took out an intricately carved wooden box. Sitting on the bed, Dorothy opened the box with reverence. Inside, nestled in a piece of faded velvet, was her mother's sapphire ring. The jewel sparkled in the dim light, like a solitary star on a dark night. Dorothy held it against her chest, letting memories flood her mind. Her mother's gentle voice, the smell of freshly baked cookies, the warmth of a long-lost hug. Maybe it's time to let go," she murmured to herself, the words heavy with unspeakable sadness. But as she was about to close the box, her fingers brushed against something else. A photograph. Heart racing, Dorothy pulled it out. A smiling girl's face looked back at her. Ashley. Her Ashley. The daughter she had been forced to give up for adoption 28 years ago, when poverty and despair had taken everything from her. Dorothy traced the outline of the child's face with a trembling finger. "My love," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Where are you now? Do you have a good life? Do you think of me?" Tears flowed freely now, staining the old photograph. But Dorothy barely noticed. She was lost in the memories, in the overwhelming love she felt for the child she had barely gotten to know. In that moment, looking at Ashley's photo and holding her mother's ring, Dorothy made a decision. She wouldn't sell the ring. She couldn't. It was more than just a piece of jewelry. It was a connection to her past, to her family, to everything she had lost. "I'll find a way," she promised herself, her voice gaining strength. "I'll work harder, I'll do whatever it takes, but I won't give up. Not this time." Carefully, Dorothy put the photo and the ring back in the box. She gently placed it back on the dresser and walked to the window. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, painting the Boston sky in shades of orange and pink. A new day will come, Dorothy thought, feeling a spark of hope light up in her chest. and with it, new possibilities. Dawn painted the sky over Boston with hues of pink and gold, finding Dorothy already up, her wrinkled hands gripping a cheap cup of tea. Her eyes, though tired, sparkled with a newfound determination. The apartment, which had seemed like a prison yesterday, was now a battleground, and Dorothy was ready for the fight. She placed the cup in the sink, ignoring the pile of dirty dishes that had accumulated. "There's no time for that now," she murmured to herself, grabbing her worn-out bag and an old newspaper. The streets of Boston were slowly waking up as Dorothy stepped outside. The morning cold nipped at her cheeks, but she barely noticed, focused on her mission. Her eyes eagerly scanned the classified ads in the newspaper as she walked, looking for any job opportunity. "Experienced housekeeper seeking work," she read softly, stopping in front of an imposing building. "Well, I've got plenty of experience," she thought, a sad smile playing at her lips. Dorothy spent the entire day knocking on doors, offering her services as a housekeeper, babysitter, anything that could earn her some money. Most people dismissed her with a polite nod, but Dorothy persisted, driven by the image of the sapphire ring and Ashley's photo. It was almost evening when Dorothy reached the last house on the street. Her legs ached, her feet throbbed inside her worn shoes, but she forced herself up the steps to the porch. Before she could knock, the door opened. A middle-aged woman with gray hair and a kind smile appeared. "Hello, can I help you?" she asked, her eyes softening at the sight of Dorothy's evident exhaustion. Dorothy swallowed hard, summoning her last ounce of strength. "Good evening, ma'am. My name is Dorothy Miller. I'm looking for work." "Any kind of work?" "Cleaning, cooking, babysitting." The woman, who introduced herself as Martha, listened attentively as Dorothy explained her situation. Her eyes filled with compassion. "Well, Dorothy," she finally said, "it just so happens that I need someone to take care of my garden. It's not much, but—" Dorothy's eyes lit up. "Oh, I'd love to," she exclaimed, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten. "I used to have a small garden, many years ago." Martha smiled. "Then it's decided. Can you start tomorrow?" As Dorothy walked back home, she felt a mix of relief and anxiety. The garden work with Martha wouldn't pay much, but it was a start. However, it was still far from enough to cover the overdue rent. When she got to her apartment, Dorothy found a note stuck to the door. It was from Karen, coldly reminding her of the eviction deadline. Dorothy felt her heart squeeze, but she refused to give in to despair. Inside the apartment, she allowed herself a moment of weakness. Sitting in her worn-out armchair, Dorothy picked up Ashley's photo, tracing the outline of the little girl's face with a trembling finger. "Oh, Ashley," she whispered, "if only you knew how your mother is struggling. But I promise, my love, I'll find a way. I'll get us a home, even if you never know." That night, Dorothy slept fitfully, dreaming of lush gardens and a girl with bright eyes running among the flowers. When she woke up, even before the sun rose, she was ready to face another day of struggle. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Dorothy worked tirelessly, taking any job that came her way. Besides Martha's garden, she managed to get cleaning jobs at various houses in the neighborhood, occasional babysitting gigs, and even street vending on weekends. Her once smooth hands were now calloused and rough. Her face showed new wrinkles, marks of worry and fatigue. But her eyes shone with fierce determination. Karen, meanwhile, continued her life of luxury and bitterness. Occasionally, she crossed paths with Dorothy in the building's hallway, exchanging only cold glances. To Karen, Dorothy was just another problematic tenant, someone to be tolerated but never truly seen. One night, exhausted after a long day of work, Dorothy heard a commotion in the hallway. Curious, she opened the door and saw Karen arguing heatedly on the phone. "I don't care what you say, John," Karen was shouting, her face red with anger. "You can't just abandon me like this." After everything I've been through? Dorothy watched silently as Karen crumpled to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. For a moment, she hesitated. Should she offer comfort? But before she could decide, Karen got up abruptly and ran back to her apartment, slamming the door behind her. That night, lying in her narrow bed, Dorothy reflected on what she had witnessed. Maybe Karen wasn't so different from her, after all. Both carried deep wounds, both fought in their own way. With that thought, Dorothy fell asleep, the sapphire ring glowing softly on the nightstand. a silent reminder that sometimes the greatest treasure we have is the ability to love and forgive. Time, relentless in its march, had left its marks on Dorothy. Her hair, once gray, was now completely white, forming a soft halo around her wrinkled face. Her hands, calloused from years of hard work, moved with the grace of someone who intimately knew every inch of the land she tended. The Pearson estate's garden, once neglected, now flourished under Dorothy's attentive care. Roses of every color danced in the gentle breeze, their soft petals contrasting with the aging hands that cultivated them. For Dorothy, each flower was a small miracle, a reminder of the beauty still present in the world. That spring morning, Dorothy was kneeling among the flower beds, her hands gently pulling out weeds that dared to threaten her precious blooms. The sun warmed her back, and the sweet aroma of roses filled the air. For a moment, she allowed herself to close her eyes, lost in the peace of the moment. "Dorothy," a young voice called, breaking the silence. She turned to see Lily, Martha's granddaughter, running toward her. The 8-year-old was a vision of joy, her golden curls bouncing in the wind. "Good morning, my little flower," Dorothy smiled, feeling her heart warm with the child's presence. "What brings you here so early?" Lily threw herself into Dorothy's arms, not minding the dirt on her clothes. "Grandma Martha sent me to bring this for you," she said, extending a small basket covered with a checkered cloth. Dorothy opened the basket to find some sandwiches and a bottle of homemade lemonade. "Oh, your grandmother is an angel, Lily. Tell her I'm very grateful." The two sat under the shade of a large oak tree, sharing the snack and chatting animatedly. Lily talked about school, her friends, her dreams of becoming a famous veterinarian. Dorothy listened attentively, her heart filling with a love she hadn't felt in a long time. For a moment, Dorothy allowed herself to imagine Lily was Ashley, the daughter she never had the chance to see grow up. What would it be like if Ashley were there, sharing sandwiches and dreams? Her eyes filled with unshed tears, a mix of joy for the present moment and sadness for what might have been. "Miss Dorothy, are you okay?" Lily asked, noticing the change in the older woman's expression. Dorothy blinked quickly, wiping away the tears. "I'm fine, dear. I was just thinking about how precious life is, and how we should cherish every moment." Lily nodded solemnly, with the innocent wisdom of children. "Is that why you take such good care of the flowers? Because they're precious?" "Exactly, my love," Dorothy smiled. "Each flower, just like each person, is unique and special. We should care for each other, just as we care for this garden." As Lily ran back home, Dorothy returned to her work, her heart a little lighter. The hours passed quickly, the sun tracing its arc across the sky as she pruned, watered, and tended to her beloved plants. It was late in the afternoon, as the sky began to turn golden with the setting sun, that Dorothy heard voices coming from the mansion's porch. Normally, she wouldn't pay attention to the employer's conversations, but something in the male voice made her stop. "Richard, are you sure it's a good idea to sell the Pearson house?" asked a feminine voice Dorothy didn't recognize. The response came in a voice that made Dorothy's heart freeze. It was a voice she hadn't heard in decades but would recognize anywhere. "I am Linda," replied the familiar voice. "Karen Pearson inherited so much money from her ex-husband that she hardly uses this property. Besides, since we adopted Ashley and changed her name to Karen, she's always been obsessed with status and money. I don't think selling this house will make any difference to her." Dorothy's world seemed to spin. Her legs gave way, and she had to lean against a nearby tree to keep from falling. Karen, Ashley. The words echoed in her mind, a whirlwind of emotions threatening to engulf her. With her heart pounding, Dorothy forced herself to move away, her hands trembling uncontrollably. She staggered to a bench hidden among the trees, out of sight from curious onlookers. There, shielded by the twilight shadows, Dorothy finally let the tears fall. Years of longing, regret, and repressed love overflowed. Karen, the cold and bitter woman who had thrown her out years ago, was actually her Ashley. How could fate be so cruel and ironic? "My girl, my Ashley," Dorothy sobbed quietly, her body shaking with the force of her emotion. "All this time, you've been so close." As night fell over the garden, Dorothy sat there, lost in her memories and the shock of the revelation. The stars began to dot the sky, indifferent to the drama unfolding below. Finally, when the full moon illuminated the garden with its silver light, Dorothy stood up. Her eyes, though swollen from crying, sparkled with new determination. She knew she couldn't reveal the truth right away. Karen, Ashley, clearly had no idea of her true identity. The revelation would need to be handled with care, with love. As she walked slowly back to her small room at the back of the property, Dorothy made a silent promise. I will find a way to reconnect with you, my daughter, no matter how long it takes, no matter how difficult it is. This time, I won't give up on you. The garden, a silent witness to her pain and promise, seemed to whisper words of comfort as she passed. The roses swayed gently in the night breeze, as if nodding in encouragement. Dorothy fell asleep that night with a heavy heart but also full of hope. Tomorrow would bring new challenges but also new possibilities, and she would be ready to face them, armed with the love of a mother who never died, just waited patiently for her moment to bloom again. The days that followed the revelation were a whirlwind of emotions for Dorothy. Each morning, she woke up with a heavy heart, the reality of her discovery weighing on her like a dark cloud. Yet, with the same determination that had sustained her all these years, she got up, put on her worn work clothes, and headed to the garden. The garden, her refuge and silent confidant, seemed to understand her pain. The roses appeared to lean towards her, offering silent comfort, while the daisies swayed gently in the breeze, as if nodding in encouragement. Dorothy, with tearful eyes, whispered to the flowers as she watered them, "Do you know, my darlings? Do you know that my Ashley is so close and yet so far away?" A voice behind her startled her. "Who's Ashley, Miss Dorothy?" Dorothy turned to find Lily, Martha's granddaughter, looking at her with innocent curiosity. The elderly woman felt her heart tighten. For a moment, she considered telling the truth, but she knew she couldn't involve the child in this complicated situation. "Ashley was someone very special to me, dear," Dorothy replied, forcing a smile. "Someone I lost a long time ago." Lily frowned, thoughtful, like a flower that wilts in the winter. Dorothy felt the tears threatening to fall, but she held them back. "Yes, my love. Something like that. But you know, sometimes flowers can come back in the spring, right?" Lily nodded enthusiastically. "That's right. Maybe your Ashley will come back too." Dorothy hugged the girl, grateful for her innocence and optimism. "Maybe, dear, maybe." As the days passed, Dorothy observed Karen with new eyes. Every gesture, every expression, was studied with the intensity of a mother trying to recover lost years. She noticed how Karen frowned when she was worried, just as Dorothy did, or how her eyes sparkled when she smiled, a rare but dazzling smile when it happened. One afternoon, while Dorothy was pruning the rose bushes near the house, she heard a heated argument coming from Karen's office. Karen's normally controlled voice was raised, trembling with emotion. "No, Marcus, I'm not going to sell the company just because you think it's a good financial idea. This company was built with the sweat and tears of my family." Dorothy froze, her heart racing. It was the first time she had heard Karen talk about family with such passion. The male voice on the other end of the line responded, inaudible to Dorothy. Karen continued, her voice now softer, almost breaking. "You don't understand, Marcus. This company is all I have left. It's the only connection I have to my adoptive parents, to my past." Dorothy felt tears streaming down her wrinkled face. Her Ashley, her girl, was still there, hidden beneath layers of hurt and distrust. The pain in her voice was palpable, echoing the pain Dorothy carried in her own heart. That night, Dorothy couldn't sleep. She sat on her small bed, the sapphire ring in her trembling hands, mentally replaying every interaction she had had with Karen over the years. How had she not realized it before? How had she not recognized her daughter's eyes, the smile that once lit up her days? Guilt and regret consumed her. If only she had fought harder, if she had found a way to keep Ashley. But no, she couldn't let herself sink into that pit of what-ifs. The past couldn't be changed, but the future was still to be written. With renewed determination, Dorothy decided she needed to get closer to Karen. Not to reveal the truth, not yet, but to try to build a bridge over the chasm that separated them. The next morning, Dorothy woke up before sunrise. Carefully, she picked the most beautiful roses from the garden and arranged them in a crystal vase she had kept for years, one of the few mementos from her former life. With her heart pounding, she left the vase at Karen's office door with a simple note, "To brighten your day." Dorothy. Hidden behind a bush, Dorothy watched Karen arrive. The younger woman stopped, surprised to see the vase. For a moment, her cold mask fell and a soft smile lit up her face. She picked up the vase, inhaled deeply the scent of the roses, and for a brief moment seemed to relax. Dorothy felt her heart fill with hope. It was a small step, but a step in the right direction. In the days that followed, Dorothy continued her small acts of kindness. A bouquet here, a repair there, always anonymous, always with the personal touch that only a mother could give. Karen, in turn, began to look at the garden more often. Sometimes, Dorothy would catch her watching her work, a curious expression on her face. One afternoon, as Dorothy struggled to move a heavy pot, Karen appeared beside her. "Let me help," she said, her voice softer than Dorothy had ever heard. Together, they moved the pot. When they finished, they stood side by side, looking at the garden in silence. "You've done an incredible job here," Karen finally said. "This garden, it reminds me of something I can't quite remember, but it makes me feel at home," Dorothy suggested softly. Karen looked at her, surprised. "Yes," she whispered, "at home." In that moment, standing among the flowers Dorothy had lovingly nurtured, mother and daughter shared a look of understanding. There was no recognition, not yet, but there was a connection, a spark of something that could, with care and patience, grow into something more. Dorothy felt her heart fill with love and hope. The road ahead was still long and uncertain, but for the first time in years, she felt she was on the right path. With each flower she planted, with each act of kindness, she was slowly rebuilding the bridge to her daughter's heart. And as the sun set over the garden, painting the sky with shades of pink and gold, Dorothy made a silent promise to the flowers, to the stars, and to herself. "I will bring you back home, my Ashley. No matter how long it takes, no matter how hard it is, we will find our way back to each other." Summer gave way to autumn, and golden leaves danced in the air, covering the garden with a multicolored carpet. Dorothy, with her wrinkled and calloused hands, worked tirelessly to prepare the garden for the approaching winter. Every movement was careful, every gesture filled with love, not just for the plants, but for the hope that was quietly growing in her heart. Karen, once a distant and cold figure, now spent more time in the garden. Sometimes she would sit on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching Dorothy work. Other times, she wandered slowly along the stone paths, occasionally stopping to touch a petal or inhale the fragrance of a flower. One particularly chilly morning, Dorothy was kneeling between the flower beds, covering the rose roots with straw to protect them from the coming cold. She heard soft footsteps behind her and, turning around, saw Karen standing there, a shawl draped over her shoulders. "Good morning, Mrs. Pearson," Dorothy said softly, trying to hide the emotion in her voice. Karen hesitated for a moment, as if gathering courage. Then, to Dorothy's surprise, she knelt beside her. Can I help?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. Dorothy felt her heart leap. "Of course," she replied, smiling warmly. "You see, we need to cover the roots to protect them from the cold." Side by side, mother and daughter worked in silence for a few minutes. The air was thick with unspoken emotions, unanswered questions. Finally, Karen spoke, her voice trembling. "You know, Dorothy, I used to have a garden when I was a child. Or at least, I think I did. It's such a vague memory." Dorothy held her breath, her heart pounding. "It must have been a beautiful garden," she said gently. Karen nodded, her eyes distant. "I remember roses, and a smell of lavender, and a woman," she sang while she worked in the garden. Dorothy fought back the tears that threatened to fall. With trembling hands, she took a small sprig of lavender she had kept in her pocket and offered it to Karen. Karen took the sprig, bringing it to her nose. Her eyes closed, and for a moment, she seemed transported to another time, another place. When she opened her eyes again, they were misty. "Why does this make me feel—" "Dorothy, why does it hurt so much?" Karen asked, her voice choked. Dorothy felt her heart break and mend at the same time. She wanted to embrace Karen, to tell her the whole truth, but she knew it wasn't the right moment yet. "Sometimes, dear," she said softly, "our most precious memories are the ones that hurt the most, because they remind us of what we've lost. Karen looked at Dorothy, really looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time. "There's something about you, Dorothy. Something familiar." The moment was interrupted by the sound of Karen's phone ringing. She stood up abruptly, murmuring a hasty thank you before running back into the house. Dorothy stood there, her heart overflowing with love and pain. So close, she thought. So close and still so far. The following days were a delicate dance between Dorothy and Karen. Small moments of connection were followed by long periods of distance. Karen seemed to be battling something within herself, alternating between moments of openness and withdrawal. One afternoon, Dorothy was pruning the last roses of the year when she heard a sob coming from behind a large oak tree. Cautiously, she approached and found Karen sitting on the ground, crying silently. "Mrs. Pearson? Karen?" Dorothy called softly. "Is everything okay?" Karen looked up, her eyes red and swollen. "No, it's not," she whispered. "Nothing is okay. I don't know who I am, Dorothy. I have everything: money, power, success. But I feel so empty." Dorothy's heart ached. Slowly, she sat down next to Karen, offering her silent presence. "You know," Karen continued, "I was adopted. My adoptive parents were wonderful, but I always felt something was missing. And now that they're gone, I feel completely alone." Dorothy took a deep breath, gathering all her courage. "Karen, dear," she said softly, "you're not alone. You never were." Karen looked at her, confused. "What do you mean?" With trembling hands, Dorothy pulled out the sapphire ring from her pocket. She had carried it with her every day since she discovered the truth, waiting for the right moment. "This ring," she began, "belonged to my mother, and I kept it all these years to give to my daughter." Karen's eyes widened, fixed on the ring. I remember that ring," she whispered. "But how?" Dorothy gently took Karen's hand, placing the ring in her palm. "Because you're my daughter, Ashley," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "I'm your mother." The world seemed to stop in that moment. Karen, Ashley, looked at Dorothy, her eyes a mix of shock, confusion, and a glimmer of recognition. "No, it can't be," she murmured, but her hands instinctively closed around the ring. "It's true, my love," Dorothy said softly. "I had to give you up for adoption when you were a baby. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. But I never stopped loving you." Karen stood up abruptly, staggering backward. "This is madness," she said, her voice trembling. I need to think." With that, she ran back to the house, leaving Dorothy sitting under the oak tree, her heart broken once again but also filled with hope. The truth had finally been revealed. What would come next? Only time would tell. Dorothy looked up at the sky, the first stars beginning to appear. "Give her strength," she whispered to the universe. "Give us a chance to heal." And so, as night fell over the garden, Dorothy waited, her heart full of love, fear, and hope for the dawn that would come. Dawn arrived slowly, painting the sky with soft hues of pink and gold. Dorothy hadn't slept, spending the night sitting on her small bed, her eyes fixed on the window, waiting for the first rays of sunlight. Her wrinkled hands clutched an old, yellowed photograph, the only one she had of Ashley as a baby. Outside, the garden seemed to hold its breath, as if even the flowers understood the importance of this day. The roses, still covered in dew, seemed to lean towards the main house where Karen, Ashley, had retreated the night before. Dorothy rose slowly, her bones protesting after a long night of vigil. With careful movements, she dressed and went out into the garden. The chilly morning air wrapped around her, but she barely felt it, her mind focused on only one thing, her daughter. As she walked through the familiar garden paths, Dorothy prayed silently. "Please," she whispered to the flowers, to the sky, to anyone who would listen, "give me a chance to explain. Give us a chance to heal." Suddenly, a movement on the porch of the main house caught her attention. Karen was there, standing and looking out at the garden. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. Karen slowly descended the steps, as if each step required a monumental effort. When she finally reached Dorothy, the two women stood face to face, separated by decades of secrets and pain, yet united by a bond that neither time nor distance could break. "Dorothy," Karen began, her voice rough, probably from a sleepless night. I don't know what to say." Dorothy felt her heart tighten. "Dear," she said softly, "you don't need to say anything. Just listen to me, please." Karen nodded silently, and the two sat on a nearby bench, surrounded by the fragrance of the roses Dorothy had lovingly tended. "Ashley, Karen," Dorothy began, her voice trembling slightly, "giving you up for adoption was the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. I was young, alone, and had nothing to offer you. I thought I was doing what was best for you, giving you a chance at a life I couldn't provide." Tears began to stream down Dorothy's wrinkled face, but she continued. "But not a day went by that I didn't think about you, didn't wonder how you were, didn't wish I could hold you again." Karen listened in silence, her own vision blurred by tears. When Dorothy finished, she finally spoke. "Why didn't you come looking for me before? When we met years ago, why didn't you say anything?" Dorothy lowered her head, the guilt weighing heavily on her shoulders. "I was afraid," she admitted. "Afraid you would hate me, afraid I might ruin the life you had built. And when I discovered who you were, you seemed so distant. I didn't know how to reach you." Karen was silent for a long moment, processing everything she had heard. Finally, she turned to Dorothy, her eyes filled with a mixture of pain and understanding. "I spent so long feeling empty," Karen said softly, "trying to fill a void I didn't understand with money, power, success. But nothing worked. And now I understand why." Dorothy hesitantly reached out, touching Karen's arm. "My dear," she said, her voice full of love, "I know I can't erase the past. I can't undo the pain I've caused you. But if you give me a chance, I'd like to try to build a future. Together." Karen looked at Dorothy's hand on her arm, then at the face of the woman who was her biological mother. Years of hurt and confusion battled with a deep desire for connection, for belonging. Slowly, Karen placed her hand over Dorothy's. "It's going to take time," she said softly. "I have so much to process, but I'd like to try." Dorothy felt her heart fill with a joy she hadn't experienced in decades. "Oh, my dear," she whispered, tears now flowing freely. "This is all I've ever wanted." The weeks that followed were a delicate dance of reconnection. Karen began spending more time in the garden with Dorothy, listening to stories of her past, learning about her roots. Dorothy, in turn, discovered the amazing woman her daughter had become, proud of her accomplishments but eager to help her heal the emotional wounds that had shaped her life. One day, as they worked together among the rose bushes, Karen turned to Dorothy with a thoughtful expression. "You know," she said, looking at her hands now calloused from working in the garden, "I always wondered where my love for gardening came from. Now I know." Dorothy smiled, her heart overflowing with love. "It's in our blood, dear. Our roots run deep." Karen nodded, a soft smile on her lips. Then she stood up abruptly, a spark in her eyes that Dorothy had never seen before. "Mom," she said, the word still new on her tongue but full of emotion, "I have an idea." In the following weeks, the Pearson mansion turned into a whirlwind of activity. Architects, builders, and landscapers came and went, all working under Karen's careful direction and Dorothy's experienced advice. Finally, on a sunny spring morning, Karen took Dorothy to see the result of their joint efforts. Before them stood a beautiful building surrounded by lush gardens. "Welcome to the Dorothy Miller Support Center," Karen said, her voice filled with pride and emotion. A place for at-risk seniors to find a home, care, and, of course, a beautiful garden to tend. Dorothy was speechless, tears streaming down her wrinkled face. "Oh, Ashley," she whispered, using Karen's birth name for the first time in decades. Karen smiled, pulling Dorothy into a tight embrace. "It's Karen now, Mom," she said softly, "but Ashley will always be here, in my heart. Thanks to you." Together, mother and daughter walked through the new gardens, their hands entwined, their hearts finally at peace. The love they had briefly shared so many years ago had bloomed again, stronger and more beautiful than ever. And so, among the roses that had witnessed their separation and now celebrated their reunion, Dorothy and Karen found not only each other, but also a new purpose. A purpose born of love, nurtured by understanding, and destined to flourish for many years to come. As the sun set over the new center, painting the sky with shades of pink and gold. Dorothy looked at her daughter and smiled. The journey had been long and difficult, but finally, after so many years, they were home. Weeks had passed since the revelation in the garden. Karen wrestled internally, her emotions swinging between anger at the abandonment and a longing for a connection she always felt was missing in her life. On a sunny afternoon, Karen found Dorothy in the garden, tending the roses that had witnessed so many moments of their story. "Dorothy," Karen began, her voice trembling, "I've spent a lot of time thinking about all this. About you, about me, about the choices that brought us here." Dorothy held her breath, her heart racing with anticipation. Karen continued, "I understand why you did what you did. It wasn't easy, but I understand. And while I can't change the past or reclaim the lost years," Karen paused, taking a deep breath, "I want to try to build a future." "I forgive you, Mom." Tears flowed freely down Dorothy's wrinkled face. "Oh, Ashley, Karen," she whispered, her heart overflowing with relief and gratitude. Mother and daughter embraced, decades of pain and separation beginning to dissipate under the warmth of forgiveness and renewed love. In the months that followed, Dorothy and Karen worked together to build a relationship they had never had the chance to have. It wasn't always easy. There were moments of tension, misunderstandings, and old wounds that still ached. But there were also laughter, discoveries, and the joy of truly getting to know each other. A year after the reconciliation, Karen surprised Dorothy with the news that she was using part of her fortune to create a foundation to support single mothers and children in vulnerable situations. "I want other women to have the options you didn't have, Mom," Karen explained, her eyes shining with determination. "I want other children to have a chance to stay with their mothers if possible." Dorothy hugged her daughter, her heart overflowing with pride and love. Together, they had turned their pain into something beautiful and meaningful. Dorothy and Karen's story reminds us that our decisions, no matter how difficult, have the power to shape not just our lives but the lives of those around us for generations. Dorothy's choice, made out of love and desperation, altered the course of 2 lives forever. Yet their story also shows us that we are not prisoners of our past. Every day, we have the opportunity to make new choices, seek forgiveness, and rebuild what was broken. The decisions we make carry the weight of consequences we cannot always predict, but they also carry the potential for healing, growth, and transformation. Dorothy's courage to reveal the truth and Karen's willingness to forgive paved the way for a new beginning, proving that it's never too late to choose to love, to forgive, to start again. In the end, it is our decisions that define who we are and the legacy we leave behind. May we, like Dorothy and Karen, have the courage to make difficult choices when necessary, the strength to face the consequences of our actions, and the wisdom to turn even our greatest pains into opportunities for growth and love.